It's interesting to know that while envy is based on wanting what someone else has, greed does not necessarily require other people. It's one of those things where you don't need someone to be in need near you in order to be greedy, right? We often give ourselves a pass. Well, I'm not being greedy because I didn't see anyone that was homeless. No one asked me for anything. That is not a requirement for greed. The availability of charity, the availability of need, of sharing, that is not a base requirement for someone to be greedy. It is possible to be greedy without being around people who are in need. Just because there isn't anyone who needs what you have does not mean that we are not living with a spirit of greed. Now, throughout this message, I'm going to be talking about greed's domain, and almost like there's a personification of greed, and greed is a character. I'm not necessarily saying that there is like one archdemon that's in charge of greed, and each sin has their own thing. I don't necessarily know if that's true. However, I think there is a very real spirit of greed. I'm not trying to give it too much power and attention, but I will be often talking about it like there's a personification here, just for conversation's sake, if that makes sense. But first and foremost, greed is an attitude and it is a condition of the heart, as we're learning as we look through these 7 deadly sins. Jesus says this in Matthew 6, "Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. And if the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve 2 masters." And this is the big one that people talk about when it comes to the love of money and greed. "Either you will hate one and love the other, or you'll be devoted one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." It's very interesting because who's heard this before? Most of us, at least 1 or 2 of us have heard this before. I've probably heard this 1,000 times. It's really interesting when we're looking at this. Nothing there talks about giving things away. There's nothing in there that's talking about you have to be charitable. You should be charitable. Those are good things. We're going to get to that later. But it is not necessary, like being greedy, and sorry, words are caught up in my mouth here. Your greedy heart, our greedy heart, has nothing to do with the needs of others around us. Everyone can be perfectly provided for, and we can still be in the domain of greed. We can still be engaging in that. He says that famous line, he says that you cannot serve God and you can't love God and love money. And that's a very, very important thing to grasp. They seem to be 2 opposing concepts, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that a little bit later. But when Jesus is talking here, he's saying all these things is do not store up for yourselves treasures here on earth. It's exactly what Thomas Aquinas was saying. He's saying, do not forsake things that are eternal for the temporary. Do not take pride in all the things you have. Do not put all your energy on material possessions, because they will one day fall apart. And then Jesus talks about the eyes being the lamp of the light of the body. What do you look at? What do you spend your time paying attention to? And we've talked about that when it comes to lust, when it comes to envy. But in the idea of greed, what if it's not someone else's thing? What if it's not a sinful thing in itself? Because the crazy thing about greed is it can take something that is not sinful and it can make it sinful. Like there's nothing sinful about money. The love of money is called the root of all evil. But money itself can do great things. You can give lots of money to charity. Money can solve a lot of problems. But if you are spending all your time looking at money, looking at material things, then it can become sinful. Greed can take things that are not inherently sinful and that can corrupt them. Jesus speaks even further about the nature of greed in Luke chapter 12. And there's people kind of talking to Jesus here and says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide his inheritance with me." So he's like, hey, tell my brother what's up. Tell me I should have half of it. Jesus replied, Man, who appointed me judge or arbiter between you? Then he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. So he's saying, hey, life is not about all the things that you acquire. And then he told this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. There I will store my surplus. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores things up for themselves, but is not rich towards God. So in this story, again, people are asking Jesus, hey, do what's fair. This person is saying, hey, divide it with me. It's not necessarily something that we would view as a greedy thing. It's not an unfair ask, but he's saying, I'm so concerned with this. I'm more concerned about the material possessions. And then Jesus goes into this story, which I'm not going to lie, from a North American mindset, this is a very difficult story to handle. Because what this person says is he has too much, so he's going to store away for later. And sometimes that would be called wisdom. There's actually parts in the Bible where people do that. And you read the story of Joseph, and he teaches Pharaoh to store up when there's good times for later. However, in this, it seems to be very specific that this is a man who's storing it up for himself. Not for other people, not even for future generations, not for his community, just for himself. And it's that attitude. And again, there's no mention of other people necessarily being in need in this story. It's just someone has the idea that they are hoarding everything for themselves. And essentially says, if you died tomorrow, who would your life benefit if you only hoarded things up for yourself? There's that underlying theme that, again, greed is a posture of the heart and an attitude, not necessarily an action. Right? That's kind of been a theme here. There was the laws of Moses where he told you not to do things. And then Jesus says, no, don't think things. Don't dwell on things. Don't have your heart pointed in this direction. Don't look certain ways. Don't engage with certain thoughts and patterns because they are deadly towards you. So we know what greed is. And the easy question is, where does greed pop up in our culture? Like everywhere? Like literally everywhere? It's all like, listen to any song, like specifically like rap. And I'm not going to be here like trashing on rap music. Cameron was playing some sick bass lines. And I was like thinking of like rap songs of my day. And by my day, I mean when I was like 5, because they were playing songs from like the 90s, but it was great. But you listen to what music is, and you listen to what we celebrate as a culture. We look at what Instagram is, and it's like, oh, get money. Have the car, have the shoes, have the house, have all these things. Get what you deserve. Get yours. Go after the power, have that status, chase all these material things. Our culture is inundated with greed. Greed is that love of the material, dwelling on the objects and things that we have or that we want. It goes beyond having enough and not just wanting more, but loving what you have already more than anything else. Did you know that you can actually be greedy just with the things you have? Like if you find yourself in love with your possessions, to a point where you could not get rid of them, in love with things and finding your identity, and that we'll go into that a little bit later. That is an attitude of greed. That is the domain of greed. That was cool. In essence, greed is when you are serving that God of money, and by money I mean material things, possessions, temporal things. Greed is when you are serving that God instead of God, instead of Jesus. So the question then is, well, if you're doing that, why is it deadly? Like, why is God saying, hey, you cannot serve me and serve something else? Why is that deadly? It's like saying, hey, like, I want to be really committed about 2 things. I want to be super committed to fitness, and I want to be super committed to eating sour keys 24 hours a day. You probably can't do both. Why? Well, we're going to talk about it, right? Because if you're serving God, that means you want to be serving into his kingdom, and you want to be paying and investing into his kingdom and doing things that will bring life to you and those around you. And if you're serving greed, it is deadly. And so we got to ask, why is it deadly? Well, there's 3 things we're going to start with. Well, we're going to get to all of them, but there's 3 important life-giving things that greed actually prevents us from engaging with. And those things are generosity, gratitude, and grace. We're using lots of G's today. Greed prevents us from engaging in this. The first thing is generosity. And there's a lot of verses in the Bible about generosity. There's a huge amount. There's like hundreds, but I'm going to read a couple. Acts 20:35 says this, in everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak remembering the words of the Lord, Jesus himself, it is more blessed to give than receive. Matthew 10:42 says this, and if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you, that person will certainly not lose their reward. 1 John 3:17 says, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? You see, it's abundantly clear that we should be generous with our possessions and with our money. But if we love money more than people, or we find our identity in it, we will not be willing to give it up for the sake of the kingdom. See, if we're greedy, we can't be generous. We can't be both. And again, on the flip side, as much as greed is an attitude of the heart, generosity is also an attitude of the heart. So do you know that you can give and still be greedy? If you find yourself in a situation where you're giving the bare minimum just to appease your conscience, or you look and you break down the math like, well, and again, I'm not saying like I want your money, but like you should be tithing. It's biblical. I'm like, well, isn't that Old Testament? You're right. The 10%, that's the bare minimum. That's Old Testament. Read the New Testament. They gave everything. So pick one. Right? And if you are giving because you feel like you should and it's out of obligation and you're wanting to hold on to what you have but you're begrudgingly giving, that is actually a spirit of greed. And we're going to get to that in a moment. There's a lot of things we're going to get to, but it's okay. It all makes sense. And again, this also goes beyond just money. This goes to power, position, to status, anything that's temporal, anything that we are not willing to share with other people, anytime that we're not willing to share the spotlight with someone else that's coming up below us, anytime that we're insecure that someone else might get a little bit of what we've got. Right? Like envy is wanting what someone else has. Greed is wanting to keep people away from what you've got. Right? Like sometimes our insecurities are rooted in greed because we're greedy with our position. We're greedy with our status. We want to be the captain of the team, and we get worried when the rookie comes up and they got the same skill set as us, but they might be a little bit faster, they might be a little bit younger, they might be a little bit stronger, so we get worried, and so we push them away. That's motivated by greed. And that's not generosity. And if we're not engaging in generosity, we're actually missing a huge part of being Christ-like, because that's a massive part of who Jesus is. If we're not engaging in generosity, we're missing a huge part of what it means to be a follower of Christ. There is so much in the Word about being generous. And if greed is barring us from that, it is deadly because it's cutting us off from a life-giving practice that Jesus wants to instill in our lives. But it goes beyond that. Greed also prevents us from experiencing gratitude. Right? Greed says that this is mine, I earned this. And greed leaves no room for thanksgiving or for gratitude. Greed values the gift, whereas gratitude values the giver. Right? You've seen that. Like, do you love the giver or the gift? Do you want what God has, or do you want who God is? But it's true. The spirit of greed positions us in a spot where we feel like what ours is ours and it should be ours, when the truth is quite different. Psalm 24:1 says this: the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all of its people belong to him. James 1:17 says this: every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. That's a cool translation. Romans 11:36 says this: for everything comes from him and exists by his power and is intended for his glory. All glory to him forever. Amen. You see, when we label everything as ours, when that's mine, when it's my position, when it's my money, when it's all these things, we're actually taking away from God, because it's something that we've been given stewardship over, but we're saying, no, this is mine. I earned this, when the truth is everything we have came from him, right? It goes right back to the fruit snack story. Like, those are not her fruit snacks. She does not have a job. And if she had a job, she'd get fired. She doesn't have a lot of marketable skills yet. She's only 4. Give her a break. You guys are mean. But she doesn't have any money. She's got a piggy bank filled with money, but she doesn't know how far a dollar goes. I could raid her piggy. I'd never do this, but I could. She wouldn't know. She has no concept of that. She's a 4-year-old. Yet she holds this little fruit snack. She's like, it's mine. And when I'm like, hey, give me one, she's like, no. I'm like, okay, well, I guess you're going to find out really what is yours. And it's nothing. Careful. This is one of the reasons why we tithe. This is one of the reasons why we give to God, and we give the first fruits to God. Not because we give him the leftovers. It's for an acknowledgement of every single thing that we have comes from him. So it's saying, God, this is the first 10%, and if you want more, it's okay. right? Like the best analogy for tithing I've ever heard someone says, like, listen, what would you rather have? Like 100% of the money managed by you or 90% of the money that's managed by God? Because he's probably a lot better at finances with me. Or like, let's take it to like 5-year-old terms. Ellie, would you rather have all the fruit snacks, but I'm chasing you and I'm going to steal them from you because I'm way bigger than you. I'm going to take them away from you because you weren't sharing. Or would you rather have all the fruit snacks except for the one I asked you for? Right? Would you rather have everything that you have that is blessed by God and God saying, yeah, no, you can be a steward of that because you've been generous with those things. And we're showing gratitude to God. We're thanking him for those things. Or would we rather be in a position where we're actually robbing God glory? We're robbing God from who he is, from the gift he's given us by saying, oh yeah, I did this. Have you ever seen someone take credit for someone else's work? It's despicable. It's awful. I hate it. Right? When someone's like, oh, like imagine like we did a great worship night and like I'm just like, oh man, I'm so glad like I worked so hard on this worship set. I'm so glad that I did such a good thing. Like they'd all leave and they'd probably punch me on the way out because I didn't do anything for it. I asked Josiah like, I don't know, a year ago, I'm like, hey, can you continue to do worship all the time? You do great. And he's like, yes, wonderful. So I'm like, thank you all the time. I'm like, man, I appreciate what you're doing because I can't do that, right? But when we say that we own these things, that this is who we are and we've earned this, we're essentially saying to God, no, you know what? I did this. I don't need you. And man, sometimes I'm really glad that he doesn't go, oh, interesting. Let's just pull my hands off for a second. Greed prevents us from experiencing gratitude. Even at an earthly level. If you're always greedy and wanting things, you can't thank someone for something because you think what they have is yours. Right? You think, oh, I deserve that gift. So you're not going to be thankful because it doesn't mean anything. Because like, of course it is mine. It should be mine. Which brings us to our next spot. Grace. Greed can actually bar us from experiencing the grace of God. And I don't know if you've ever looked at it this way, but it's actually a really powerful thing. This is Matthew 18, verses 23. There's a lot here, but this is a good one. This is Jesus talking. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began his settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold, that's a lot of money, was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the minister ordered that he, his wife, and his children all be sold to repay his debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged. I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go. But when the servant went out, he found out that one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins, which is nowhere near 10,000 bags of gold, in case you're counting. He grabbed him, began to choke him, and said, pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown to prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you have the mercy on your fellow servant that I just had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat you unless you forgive your brother and sister from your heart. Now, often when we talk about this, we're talking about it in the sense of forgiveness. But at the same time, it's that idea of greed that can stop us from forgiving people. Because we know in this story that what Jesus is talking about is that we have been forgiven in this massive debt. We have been forgiven this unbelievable amount of sin. The weight of everything wrong we've ever done is fallen on Jesus instead of us. He's willingly paid for it. And so when we go around and we've got the greediness, whether it's spiritual greediness, emotional greediness, or actually like material greed, say, hey, what I've been given today isn't enough. I want more. Right? That's literally what's happening with this man, right? He walks away. Essentially, he's been given 10,000 bags of gold. That's like multiple lifetimes of wages. Right? His debt was forgiven, which means he's been given that amount of money. And he's walking and someone owes him $30 and he chokes him out for it. Because he's saying, hey, what I was given today is not enough. I want more. What I have is not enough. I want more. What you have is what you owe me. It belongs to me. When we engage with greed, when we are trying to keep things and hold so tightly to these things, when we chase after money and possessions, what we're telling God is, listen, what you've given me is not enough. I want more. And as a result of that, we cannot experience grace in the way that we're meant to. Like, I think of this story pretty often. And it's like, I imagine how great, like, the cool thing about the king is in this situation, like, yeah, it's a couple lifetimes of work for that servant, but it's nothing to the king. Like, it might be significant, but it's not going to break his back. Like, imagine if I owed Elon Musk $5 million. $5 million is the drop in the pan to a guy like that, right? And if he forgave me, he'd probably feel pretty great. He'd be like, oh man, I feel awesome. I just made that guy's day. I just made the guy's life. And then I'm walking, and then Josiah's like, hey man, I know I owed you $20, and I could try to choke Josiah out. Or if I'm like, you know what, Josiah? You're good. We're fine. I would feel great. I would. But if I had to hassle Josiah for my $20, for my $5, for my $30, it's going up. There's interest. If I had to hassle him, I'm not going to feel great. And truthfully, the amount of money that I'm getting is probably less good than the feeling that I'm giving up to try to chase it. It stops us from experiencing grace, and it also stops us from extending grace. Greed can keep us from being Christ-like in one of the most fundamental ways that we are supposed to be following Jesus, and that is doing unto others what we would not have done. Doing unto others beyond what we are owed. Paying the way for someone else. Greed prevents us from doing that. And finally, this kind of lands on one thing. There's one last thing that greed kind of does. It's a really, really hard one to deal with. Because up until this point, I'm going to sit down for you. Oh, sorry. Yadik's ahead of the game. Go Yadik. Greed causes us to define ourselves by something other than a child of God. And again, up until this point in the sermon, it's very easy. Like, oh, these are all bad things. Like, I'm not hoarding money. I'm not that fat cat, that Monopoly guy sitting on Boardwalk with 2 hotels when someone comes to him, I got pay up or go to jail. I haven't played Monopoly in a long time. I don't know how that works. But greed can also cause us to define ourselves by something other than a child of God. This is Matthew verses 10, and this is a very famous parable again. This is or story, and this is called the rich young ruler. It says this, and this is again Jesus, 10:17. As he was setting out on a journey, a man ran up to him and knelt before him. He asked, "Good teacher, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life?" But Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments: do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony, do not defraud, honor your father and mother." And he said to him, "Teacher, I have kept all these things from my youth." Looking at him, Jesus showed love to him and said to him, "One thing you lack. Go and sell all your possessions and give to the poor. Then you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." But he was deeply dismayed by these words, and he went away grieving, because he was one that owned much property. In this situation, we have a man that is a good person. He does the right things. He's kept all the commandments since his youth. He probably messed up on some of them, but he kept all of them. He lived a good life. And Jesus said, yeah, but you find your identity in the things that you own. You find your identity in your possessions, so you need to get rid of them. And in this moment, Jesus is telling him that because Jesus knows his heart, right? If the possessions didn't hold that much over them, maybe he wouldn't ask him to give it up. I don't know. But the truth is, we can have good things. We can be doing right things. But if we define ourselves by what we have, if we define ourselves by the material things, by the possessions, by the jobs, by the relationships that we have, and we put that above our relationship with God, that is greed. If we find ourselves in a situation where we're like, oh, I'm not going to give that up. If we let anything else define us, right? I used to have this conversation a lot with people, like in ministry every once in a while, like different churches will have different rules and different things that you should and should not do. And like sometimes it's like, oh, like I've worked at churches where they say like I don't drink a lot of alcohol. I'm not told that I can't. I mean, I might be told that I don't drink. It's not healthy for you. It's expensive, and I don't like the taste because I'm a child. Like, give me orange juice. But like, I'm not. It's not a sin to drink alcohol, but I don't really drink alcohol. But I've worked at churches before where people are like, oh yeah, like you don't do that if you're working or something to do. And I've seen people get all up in arms about it, like, well, but that's my right to do that. And like, yeah, sure, maybe, but at the same time, if I came here and like, I love Dr. Pepper, I love Coke Zero. Everyone knows I love Coke Zero. Where's Bridget? Bridget knows I love Coke Zero. If I came to a church at one point, or if Jesus came and said, Ben, listen, you need to stop drinking Coke Zero for whatever reason. I'm like, I know it's from God. And I'm like, but Coke Zero is good. It's low in calories. It tastes delicious. They're not paying me for this, but come on. It's good. And I was unwilling to give that up in that moment. I'm actually finding my identity in a casual enjoyer of Coke Zero or an extreme enjoyer of Coke Zero more than I am in as being a child of God. Listen, if there's anything in your life that you're holding to your heart closer than your relationship with God, that is a problem area. And when that becomes a material thing or something that is temporal, that is greed. And that's something that needs to be let go so we can experience the grace and the love of God. Because on the counter side of greed is generosity, right? Is gratitude, is grace, is identity as a child. And I love the terminology of child of God because there's a difference between a child and an employee. Right? We see this, and this isn't in my notes, but we see this in the parable of the lost son, right? The prodigal son who goes away. He is a greedy guy. He sees he wants money. He asks his dad for all the money. He takes the money. He goes away. He realizes that at that point that he's spent all of his money and he wants to come home and essentially he wants to sell himself to his dad so he can just work to earn a living wage so he can eat. Because he has that greed mindset where it's like, well, yeah, it's all about possessions. It's all about what I can do, what I can get. But the father still sees him as a child and says, no, it doesn't matter what you have. I'm actually going to invite you in anyway. You see, there's actually a freedom that comes when you drop your identity that's based on material and temporal things, because those material and temporal things will fade. They will run out. You will not always be the greatest athlete. You will not always be the funniest person. You will not always have the coolest outfits. You will not always have the best social media. You will not always be the most talented person. You will not always have the most money. You will not always have the nicest car. You will not always have the coolest friends. You will not always have the best ideas. You will not always be the most eloquent speaker, but you will always be a child of God. So we need to find our identity in that and live in that freedom. And push away the rat race of greed, of always trying to acquire things, and realize that the greatest thing that we could ever acquire has already been given to us freely. And we need to be gracious and grateful for that gift.